Amid the hum of a bustling airport, Naomi Brooks moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who belonged. The terminal was alive with its usual symphony: families herding children, business travelers clutching laptops, and the occasional lost tourists scanning for direction. Naomi's long navy trench coat trailed behind her, a leather satchel hooked over her arm, and a sleek boarding pass tucked in her palm. Naomi didn't simply walk, she glided, with a quiet authority that made heads turn. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, flicked to the departure screens. She didn't need to check. She had memorized her itinerary the moment she booked the flight. This was routine. Naomi was always prepared. But today felt different. For once, she wasn't boarding for business meetings or corporate takeovers. She was taking this flight to escape, a rare pocket of solitude from the overwhelming demands of managing Brooks Aviation, the airline she had built from the ground up. It was more than just a company. It was a testament to every battle she had fought, every door she had forced open. As Naomi approached the first-class lounge, she handed her boarding pass to the attendant with a polite smile. The attendant glanced at her, barely, and waved her through. There it was again, the flicker of doubt she had grown accustomed to seeing. A brief pause, a hesitation that whispered, "Are you sure you belong here?" Naomi brushed it off like she always did. Success had taught her to choose which battles were worth her time. She settled into a corner of the lounge, the warm leather seat cradling her as she sipped a freshly brewed cappuccino. A novel lay open in her lap, one she had been meaning to finish for months, but never quite had the chance. For a brief moment, Naomi felt at peace. Then her flight was called. As she approached the gate, Naomi noticed the subtle shift in energy. Smiles from the staff grew tighter, more forced. Conversations that flowed around other passengers halted when her turn came. It wasn't obvious, but Naomi noticed. The young gate agent, barely past his 20s, scanned her boarding pass. His eyes darted to the first-class stamp, lingering just a second longer than necessary. He masked his surprise poorly. "This way, ma'am," he said, trying to sound professional but stumbling over his words. Naomi offered a warm, knowing smile and stepped forward. She had seen this reaction countless times. For some, wealth and power wore a very specific face, and it wasn't hers. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin was a sanctuary of plush cream leather seats, ambient lighting, and curated menus waiting at every station. Naomi slid into her window seat, carefully draping her scarf over the armrest. The faint hum of the plane's engines outside felt like a lullaby, promising a few hours of peace. That peace didn't last. A flight attendant materialized by her seat, her blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Her name tag glinted in the soft cabin light. Cheryl. Her smile was thin, pressed tightly enough to look uncomfortable. "Can I get you anything to drink?" Cheryl's tone was clipped, efficient, but noticeably colder than it had been with the passenger in front of Naomi. "Just some water, please," Naomi replied, keeping her tone polite. Cheryl nodded curtly and strode away, her heels striking the floor harder than necessary. Naomi exhaled slowly, brushing it off. Maybe Cheryl was having a long day. Maybe it was nothing. But Naomi wasn't naive. She had spent too long climbing the ranks of industries that had rarely welcomed her to mistake coincidence for something more. Still, she chose to let it go, for now. As the first-class cabin settled into a quiet hum, Naomi Brooks watched as the flight attendant, Cheryl, returned with a cart of headphones. Cheryl moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, her smile warm and polite, until she reached Naomi's row. There was a pause, a noticeable one. Cheryl's gaze lingered on Naomi for just a beat too long, her eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating whether Naomi truly belonged in the seat she occupied. Naomi arched a brow, meeting the moment with calm resolve. "Could I have my headphones, please?" Naomi asked, her voice level but carrying an undercurrent of authority. Cheryl's lips twitched into what might have been a smile under different circumstances, but here it felt forced, as though the words she was about to say brought her some quiet satisfaction. "Those are reserved for first-class passengers," Cheryl replied, each word slow and deliberate, as if Naomi hadn't understood. Naomi blinked. Momentarily caught off guard, she glanced around, confirming the obvious. She was in first class. Her leather bag sat neatly by her side, and the boarding pass tucked into her coat pocket clearly displayed her seat assignment. I am in first class, Naomi said, gesturing lightly to the pristine cabin around her. Cheryl's eyes followed Naomi's hand, her gaze lingering just long enough to register the truth. But instead of apologizing, Cheryl's smirk deepened, curling at the corners. Of course you are, Cheryl muttered, her voice dripping with condescension. She turned on her heel and continued down the aisle without another glance. Naomi remained still, her hands curling around the armrests. The cabin felt heavier now, a ripple of discomfort settling among the other passengers. Across the aisle, a woman caught Naomi's eye, her expression tight with silent outrage, as if she too had witnessed more than enough. Naomi exhaled slowly, her heart thrumming just a little faster. She had spent years fighting battles like this, clawing her way up in an industry that never quite expected her to succeed. And while she had learned when to rise and when to let things go, today felt different. Today, Naomi wasn't letting it slide. Her fingers brushed against her phone, resting lightly on the seat beside her. Naomi didn't need to make a scene. There were far more effective ways to address situations like this. This wasn't just about headphones, it was about respect. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Naomi remained seated, her gaze steady and calm, but the quiet storm brewing beneath her surface refused to dissipate. Cheryl reappeared shortly after, this time balancing a tray of water glasses with a little too much care. She moved briskly down the aisle, but when she reached Naomi's seat, there was another pause. Cheryl leaned forward, setting Naomi's glass down with a touch more force than necessary. The water rippled slightly, droplets skimming over the edge onto the tray table. "There you go," Cheryl said, her voice light but sharp around the edges, as though the simple act of service carried a personal cost. Naomi met Cheryl's gaze without flinching. She smiled faintly, lifting the glass with a steady hand. "Thank you," Naomi replied, her tone as cool as the water she sipped. Cheryl lingered for a second longer, as if waiting for Naomi to flinch, to react, to acknowledge the subtle insult embedded in the interaction. But Naomi didn't. Cheryl's eyes narrowed, just for a heartbeat, before she spun on her heel and continued down the aisle. Naomi watched her closely, observing how Cheryl's entire demeanor shifted as she approached the next passenger, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit. Cheryl's smile brightened, her tone lifting into something far friendlier as she bent slightly to refill his water. The difference was glaring. Naomi sighed softly, setting the glass back down. The faint metallic taste lingered, but the water wasn't what left a bitter aftertaste. She wasn't unfamiliar with people like Cheryl, those who saw her success and chose to overlook it, those who refused to connect wealth or status with someone who looked like Naomi. And usually, Naomi let them underestimate her, but today wasn't one of those days. Moments later, Cheryl reappeared, this time pushing a cart of sleek headphones. She handed out pairs to each passenger with a bright, rehearsed smile. "Enjoy your flight," she chirped as she moved along. When she reached Naomi's row, however, Cheryl hesitated again. Her hand hovered over the cart, and for a fleeting second, Naomi saw it, the flicker of doubt. The question that lingered in Cheryl's mind, does she really belong here? Naomi sat straighter, her calm expression unwavering. "Excuse me," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the cabin. "May I have my headphones now?" Cheryl's smile faltered, but she quickly masked it with faux sweetness. "I'm sorry," Cheryl replied smoothly. "It seems we've run out." Naomi's eyes drifted to the cart, where at least 10 unopened pairs of headphones sat in plain view. "Run out?" Naomi repeated, her brow lifting. "There appear to be plenty left." Cheryl's expression hardened, the polite mask slipping. "These are reserved for passengers who requested them in advance," Cheryl replied, her words slow, as if Naomi needed things spelled out. The tension in the cabin thickened, and Naomi felt the eyes of the other passengers drifting toward her row. But she remained composed, folding her hands neatly on her lap. "I wasn't aware that first-class passengers needed to pre-request basic amenities," Naomi said quietly, her gaze locking onto Cheryl's. Cheryl opened her mouth to respond, but across the aisle, a man cleared his throat loudly. "I didn't pre-request mine," he said, lifting his headphones. "And I still got a pair." Cheryl froze, her face paling. Naomi said nothing, simply waiting. For the first time, Cheryl didn't have a quick response. Naomi Brooks sat perfectly still, her gaze locked on Cheryl as the flight attendant's hand hovered over the half-full cart of headphones. The pause stretched just a little too long. Naomi's posture remained poised, but there was an unmistakable tension beneath the surface. "Excuse me," Naomi said, her voice cutting softly through the low murmur of the cabin. "May I have my headphones now?" Cheryl straightened, her eyes flicking to Naomi with thinly veiled disdain. "I'm sorry," Cheryl said, her tones syrupy and insincere. "It seems we've run out." Naomi's brow lifted slightly, her lips parting, but no immediate words came. She glanced pointedly at the cart. There they were, rows of neatly wrapped headphones still waiting to be distributed. "Run out?" Naomi repeated, her voice quiet but firm. Her hand gestured to the cart. "It looks like you have plenty left." Cheryl's polite mask shifted, her forced smile flattening. "Those are reserved for passengers who pre-requested them," she replied, each word slow and deliberate, as if Naomi needed extra explanation. "It's standard policy." A ripple of discomfort passed through the cabin. Several nearby passengers shifted, stealing glances toward Naomi's row, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Naomi held Cheryl's gaze, unflinching. "I wasn't aware standard policy excluded certain passengers," Naomi said calmly, folding her hands in her lap. The sharpness in her tone made Cheryl's smile falter for the first time. Cheryl's mouth opened, ready to fire back with another flimsy excuse, but a voice from across the aisle cut in. "Excuse me," a man said, his tone edged with irritation. He lifted the headphones resting around his neck. "I didn't pre-request mine. I still got a pair." Cheryl froze, visibly stiffening as she turned to face him. "Well, that's different," she stammered, her eyes darting between Naomi and the man. "Is it?" The man pressed, his brow arching. "Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look very different at all." Cheryl's lips pressed into a thin, tense line. Naomi watched as Cheryl's shoulders squared, her inner debate flickering plainly across her face. Escalate or retreat. Finally, Cheryl inhaled sharply and turned back to Naomi with a forced smile that didn't touch her eyes. "I'll see what I can do," she said curtly. Snatching a pair from the cart, Cheryl set the headphones down on Naomi's tray table with a little more force than necessary. "Enjoy your flight," she added briskly, before pivoting and continuing down the aisle, her heels striking hard against the carpet. Naomi sat in silence for a moment, her eyes fixed on the headphones resting neatly before her. The cabin air felt heavier now. Across the aisle, the man who had spoken up caught her eye. Naomi offered him a small nod of gratitude. He nodded back, his expression reflecting quiet solidarity. Naomi slipped the headphones over her ears, but the faint satisfaction that flickered was short-lived. She knew this wasn't just about headphones. It was about control, about Cheryl's subtle attempt to remind Naomi that, in her eyes, she didn't belong here. But Naomi wasn't about to let that message land. Her fingers drifted toward her phone. With a calm, steady hand, she began to compose a message. This wasn't an inconvenience to be brushed aside. This was about principle. The storm was coming, and Naomi was ready. The cabin lights dimmed softly as the plane began its taxi to the runway. The pilot's muffled announcements filtered through the speakers, but Naomi barely registered them. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying every detail of the encounter. To anyone watching, Naomi appeared perfectly calm, her breathing slow, her hands resting lightly on her knees. But inside, fire smoldered. This wasn't just a flight. It was a reminder of the quiet battles Naomi had been fighting her entire life. As the plane lifted smoothly into the sky, Cheryl reappeared, this time pushing a cart of drinks and snacks. Her face was a mask of professional detachment, but her movements felt tight, mechanical. When she stopped at Naomi's row, there was that same hesitation. "Would you like something to drink?" Cheryl asked, her voice devoid of warmth. Naomi looked up at her, calm but piercing. "A glass of sparkling water, please." Cheryl nodded stiffly, grabbing a bottle from the cart. As she poured, Naomi noticed the subtle tremble in Cheryl's hand, the cracks beginning to show. As Naomi Brooks watched, Cheryl poured the sparkling water into a glass, her movements crisp and efficient. But as she placed it on Naomi's tray table, Cheryl's hand slipped, just enough to send the glass tipping forward. The cold liquid spilled over Naomi's lap, soaking into her slacks and leather tote. "Oh dear," Cheryl said, her tone laced with mock concern. "I'm so sorry." Naomi stared down at her drenched clothes, her hand moving with deliberate calm as she reached for a napkin. She dabbed at the water slowly, sensing Cheryl's gaze lingering. Cheryl didn't leave. Her lips twitched, fighting the smirk threatening to emerge. "Let me get you a towel," Cheryl added, though she made no move to fetch one. Naomi's jaw tightened slightly as she blotted at the fabric. Then, she looked up, locking eyes with Cheryl. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "I think that would be appropriate," Naomi said, her voice cool but edged with steel. Cheryl hesitated for a moment, just long enough for Naomi to see her internal debate, before turning sharply on her heel and walking briskly toward the galley. Naomi followed her with her eyes, her mind racing. This wasn't an accident. The spill. The headphones. Each action small but intentional. Naomi had seen it before. Microaggressions designed to undermine, to remind her of the spaces she was not expected to occupy. As Naomi dabbed her lap, a voice from across the aisle broke the silence. "Are you all right?" Naomi glanced up. The man leaning slightly toward her was middle-aged, with graying hair and a kind face marked by quiet authority. "I'm fine," Naomi said, offering a faint smile. "Thank you." The man frowned, shaking his head. "She did that on purpose," he said in a low voice. "I saw her." Naomi's smile faded, replaced by a look of calm resolve. "I know," she replied simply. The man hesitated for a beat, then leaned closer. "You shouldn't have to put up with this," he said. "If you need a witness, I'm more than happy to back you up." Naomi's heart warmed slightly at his quiet solidarity. "I appreciate that," she replied, "but I have my own way of handling things." By the time Cheryl returned with a towel, her earlier confidence seemed to have dimmed. Without a word, she placed the towel on Naomi's tray table and moved quickly down the aisle. Naomi took her time blotting her bag and slacks, her movements slow and reflective. Once the initial cleanup was done, Naomi reached for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Daniel Rhodes, the CEO of Brooks Aviation. Her thumb hovered over the call button for only a moment before pressing it. The line rang twice before Daniel's voice, familiar and warm, came through. "Naomi," he greeted, sounding surprised. "What a nice surprise. What can I do for you?" Naomi's eyes flicked briefly around the cabin. Her voice remained low, but there was no mistaking the firmness in her tone. "Daniel, I'm on Flight 316, and there's an issue with the crew." The line fell quiet for a second. "What kind of issue?" Daniel's tone shifted immediately to one of concern. Naomi recounted the events precisely, leaving out no details. Her words were measured, without embellishment. The facts alone were damning enough. By the time she finished, Daniel's voice had hardened. "This is unacceptable," he said sharply. "I'll take care of it personally." Naomi thanked him and ended the call, slipping her phone back into her bag. As she leaned back in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the armrests, the fire that had burned in her chest began to cool. Justice was coming. Not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel small by people like Cheryl. The rest of the flight passed in tense silence. Cheryl avoided Naomi's row entirely. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by unease. Naomi could sense even from afar. The other passengers exchanged quiet glances, their curiosity palpable. Naomi closed her eyes, letting the soft hum of the engines wash over her. She wasn't angry anymore, not even upset. She was focused. This wasn't about demanding an apology or compensation. Naomi wanted accountability. She wanted change. As the plane began its descent, Naomi opened her eyes, gazing out the window. The city lights below glittered like stars scattered across the landscape, a tapestry of possibilities stretching endlessly into the horizon. She took a steady breath. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The city of Brighton Bay stretched beneath the plane, its lights shimmering like constellations against the dark canvas of the night. Naomi Brooks stared out the window, her faint reflection watching her back. Her thoughts swirled, tethered to the quiet storm she had carried since the moment she stepped onto the aircraft. As the plane touched down with a soft bump, a collective sigh rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, eager to disembark. Naomi remained still, her posture composed, her expression calm and unreadable. She knew the events of this flight would echo far beyond this cabin. The aircraft taxied to the gate, the metallic groan of the brakes slicing through the silence. Cheryl's voice, bright and professional, chimed over the intercom. "Welcome to Brighton Bay. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us." Naomi's lips tightened slightly. Cheryl's feigned politeness grated against her, but Naomi's hands rested lightly on her lap, unmoving. The storm inside her had settled, not extinguished, but condensed into something sharp, precise. As the plane came to a halt, Cheryl and the other attendants made their way down the aisle, smiling stiffly at passengers and offering polite farewells. When Cheryl reached Naomi's row, their eyes met. Naomi held her gaze, calm, unwavering. Cheryl looked away first. Her smile faltered as she quickly moved on, her steps just a little less sure than before. Naomi watched Cheryl retreat, noting the stiffness in her shoulders, the forced cheer lingering in her voice. The seatbelt chime echoed overhead, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Naomi remained seated, slipping her phone into her leather tote and draping her coat over her arm with practiced ease. She wasn't in a rush. There was no need to hurry. As the first-class passengers started to disembark, a figure entered the cabin. The man's tailored suit and confident stride commanded attention. His presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere. 2 airline staff followed him, their expressions tight with nervousness. His eyes scanned the cabin, halting the moment they found Naomi. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of what was to come. It was Daniel Rhodes, CEO of Brooks Aviation. Daniel approached Naomi's row, pausing with a firm handshake. "Naomi," he greeted, his voice low but resolute. "I apologize for the delay. May I have a word with you?" Naomi rose smoothly, slipping into her coat. "Of course," she replied, her tone measured as she stepped into the aisle. She gestured for him to lead the way. As they exited the plane, Daniel turned to the 2 staff members flanking him. "Please ensure the other passengers are taken care of," he instructed. "I'll handle this personally." They nodded, relief flashing briefly across their faces as they stepped aside. Naomi followed Daniel through the jet bridge, where a small cluster of senior airline staff waited. Among them stood Cheryl. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She avoided Naomi's gaze. Her earlier confidence drained away, leaving only unease. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but his tone cut like ice. "Cheryl," he said, his voice even. "I understand there were issues on this flight. Would you care to explain?" Cheryl's eyes darted nervously between Daniel and Naomi. Her words tumbled out, disjointed. I don't know what you mean, sir. Everything went smoothly. There were no complaints from passengers." Daniel's brow arched slightly, his gaze hardening. "Is that so?" he asked, deceptively calm. "Because I've been given a very different account." Naomi took a step forward, her presence commanding but controlled. "Mr. Rhodes," she said formally, addressing him in front of the group. "If I may." Daniel nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Naomi turned to Cheryl, her voice steady and deliberate. "Your behavior on this flight was unprofessional and discriminatory. You denied me services offered to other passengers without hesitation. You spilled water on me, whether intentional or not, and failed to take responsibility. And your tone throughout was condescending, something I believe was neither accidental nor isolated." Cheryl's face flushed deep red. Her mouth opened, searching for the right words, but nothing came. I didn't mean." Naomi raised a hand, cutting her off. "This isn't about intent," Naomi said quietly but firmly. "It's about action, and your actions were unacceptable." Daniel's gaze flicked to Cheryl, sharp as steel. "This," he said coldly, "is not the standard we uphold at Brooks Aviation." Cheryl shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the floor. Daniel turned toward the senior staff. "Effective immediately, Cheryl is suspended pending further investigation. I expect full cooperation from everyone involved." A murmur passed through the group, but no one spoke up. Daniel's eyes settled on Cheryl one final time. "Consider this a lesson in accountability." 2 security personnel stepped forward, ready to escort Cheryl from the jet bridge. Her protests were soft, half-formed, but no one paid them much attention as she was led away. Daniel exhaled quietly, turning back to Naomi. "Naomi, I can't apologize enough for what happened," he said, his tone softer. "This will not be ignored. You have my word." Naomi's gaze met his, calm but resolute. "Thank you, Daniel," she replied. "But this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no one else experiences what I did today." Daniel nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I promise change will follow." As the remaining staff dispersed, Naomi stood alone at the gate for a moment, gazing out at the twinkling lights of Brighton Bay. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a precedent had been set. As she walked toward the terminal, Naomi's steps were steady, purposeful. The storm had passed, but its impact would remain, rippling long after she was gone. Daniel Rhodes' voice cut through the air with sharp finality. Cheryl's actions are a clear violation of company policy. Effective immediately, she is relieved of her duties. Escort her off the premises. Cheryl's eyes widened, her face draining of color. "Wait, please," she stammered, her voice cracking. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean—" Daniel silenced her with a calm but decisive wave of his hand. "Your behavior has no place here," he said coldly. "Consider this your final lesson in accountability." Two security personnel stepped forward, their demeanor professional but firm. Cheryl hesitated for a fraction of a second before one of them gently motioned her to follow. Her protests faded as she disappeared down the jet bridge, leaving behind a heavy silence. Daniel turned back to Naomi Brooks, his expression softening as the tension slowly unraveled. "Naomi, I cannot apologize enough for what happened today," he said sincerely. "I assure you this incident will lead to immediate changes within our staff training and hiring practices." Naomi met his gaze, her eyes steady and unreadable. "Thank you, Daniel," she said quietly. "But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else experiences what I did today." Daniel inclined his head. "You have my word." As the senior staff dispersed, Naomi lingered for a moment in the quiet of the jet bridge. She inhaled deeply, letting her shoulders relax for the first time since boarding. Justice had been served, not in loud demands, but in quiet, firm resolve. But more importantly, a precedent had been set. Naomi walked toward the terminal, her footsteps light but purposeful. The storm had passed, but its imprint would linger, a reminder that standing for what is right often creates ripples far beyond the moment itself. She stepped into the bright, bustling terminal, with the calm grace of someone who had weathered storms before and emerged stronger. The chatter of travelers, the distant hum of announcements, it all seemed muted, far removed from the weight still resting in Naomi's chest. As she approached the Skylux lounge, reserved for first-class travelers, she caught her reflection in the glass doors. Her coat was slightly wrinkled from the flight, the faint stain of water on her slacks, a reminder of Cheryl's petty cruelty, hadn't fully dried. And yet, her posture was impeccable. Strength wasn't about avoiding damage, it was about endurance. And today had required plenty of that. Inside the lounge's quiet elegance, a concierge approached swiftly. "May I take your coat or bag?" he asked with a polite smile. Naomi waved him off gently. "No thank you. I just need a moment." She walked to the large floor-to-ceiling windows, settling into a seat with a view of the tarmac. The fading twilight draped the planes in long shadows, their silhouettes outlined by the distant glow of runway lights. A cup of steaming herbal tea soon arrived at her table. Naomi cradled the porcelain cup between her hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. It was a small comfort, but a welcome one. Her phone buzzed softly on the table, the screen lighting up with new notifications. A message from her assistant, Leah, appeared at the top. "Just heard what happened. Do you need me to draft a statement?" Naomi smiled faintly, appreciating Leah's readiness. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she typed back swiftly. "Not yet. This is personal. I'll handle it." The tea cooled as Naomi sat there, replaying every detail from the flight. She remembered Cheryl's smug face when she denied Naomi those headphones, the way she tried to diminish her presence with microaggressions that whispered of exclusion. But Naomi didn't feel satisfaction in Cheryl's removal. Instead, the memory fueled something deeper. Resolve. She didn't want revenge. She wanted systemic change. The soft footsteps approaching her table pulled Naomi from her thoughts. She glanced up, recognizing the man from across the aisle during the flight. He held a small carry-on bag in one hand, his expression somewhere between hesitation and determination. "Excuse me, Miss Brooks," he began, his voice warm but tentative. "I don't mean to intrude, but I just wanted to thank you." Naomi's brow arched slightly. "Thank me?" she asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. He placed his bag down and took the seat, leaning forward slightly. "For standing up to that flight attendant," he said sincerely. "I saw everything, and I should have said something sooner. but watching how you handled it, well, it reminded me that silence isn't the answer." Naomi studied him for a moment, searching his face. He seemed genuine. His words carried the weight of reflection, perhaps even guilt. "It wasn't easy," Naomi admitted softly, "but ignoring it would have been harder. I've faced this kind of thing before, and I doubt this will be the last time." The man nodded solemnly. "You're right. It happens too often. And people like me, we let it slide because it doesn't affect us directly. But that's no excuse." Naomi's expression softened. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said quietly. "Speaking up now matters just as much." The man reached into his pocket and slid a business card across the table. "I run a small nonprofit focused on workplace equality," he explained. "If you ever need an ally, or if there's a way we can work together, I'd be honored." Naomi picked up the card, reading his name, David Grant, and the embossed logo beneath it. She smiled faintly and slipped it into her bag. "Thank you, David," she replied. "I'll keep this in mind." As David departed, Naomi leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting once again to the tarmac. This wasn't over. Cheryl was just one person, a symptom of something larger. Naomi knew the fight wouldn't end here. But as she sipped the last of her tea, Naomi felt more prepared than ever to face it head-on. Naomi Brooks met the man's gaze, her expression softening. "It's never too late to do better," she said gently. "Speaking up now matters just as much." They sat quietly for a moment, the soft hum of the lounge filling the space between them. The weight of unspoken understanding lingered. After a brief pause, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "I run a nonprofit," he said. "We focus on workplace equity and anti-discrimination training. If there's ever a way we can collaborate, I'd be honored." Naomi picked up the card, her eyes scanning the embossed text. The name David Grant stood out in clean professional lettering. A faint smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she said, slipping the card into her bag. "I'll keep this in mind." As David gathered his things and departed, Naomi leaned back, her gaze drifting to the large windows overlooking the tarmac. The sky was slowly darkening, the silhouettes of planes faintly outlined against the last streaks of twilight. Her thoughts shifted. Cheryl was just one person, one symptom of something much larger. Addressing her behavior was necessary, but it wasn't enough. Naomi understood that if she truly wanted to spark lasting change, she had to go beyond this isolated incident. Her fingers brushed against her phone. She unlocked it and began typing a new message. "Daniel, thank you for handling the situation today. I'd like to propose something further, a comprehensive review of our employee training programs with an emphasis on inclusivity and unconscious bias. This can't just be a one-time fix. Let's make this a turning point for the company." Naomi read over the message carefully, her focus unwavering. This wasn't just about her experience, it was about ensuring no one else faced the same barriers. With a deep breath, she hit send. The response came not long after, as the evening shadows deepened. "Absolutely. Let's meet next week to discuss this in detail. Your leadership is invaluable, Naomi. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Daniel." Naomi set her phone down, her eyes lingering on the city lights twinkling beyond the glass. Each light felt like a quiet reminder of endless possibilities. A sense of calm washed over her, not because the fight was over, but because it had only just begun. This wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of a new chapter, one that would ripple far beyond this single flight. Naomi had taken a moment of injustice and turned it into an opportunity for change, proving that even in the face of adversity, grace and resolve could lead to something greater. She took another sip of tea, letting the warmth ground her. Outside, a plane ascended into the sky, its lights vanishing into the night. Naomi watched it go, her heart steady, her purpose clear. The following days unfolded like a slow, deliberate dance, each step forward carefully measured. Back at her sleek penthouse in Brighton Bay, Naomi gazed out over the sprawling skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a living portrait, serene, unaware of the battles quietly waged beneath its surface. She sat at the dining table, a steaming cup of chamomile tea resting between her hands. The occasional evening breeze rustled through the open balcony doors, filling the quiet room with a faint sense of calm. Her laptop glowed softly in front of her, illuminating documents, emails, and one message she had been rereading all evening. Naomi, I've spoken with the board. They're fully on board with your proposal for company-wide changes. Let's draft the agenda for next week's meeting. Daniel. The words were encouraging, but Naomi felt their weight. Change on this scale wasn't just about policies or mandatory training sessions. It was about shifting deeply rooted mindsets, dismantling biases often invisible to those who benefited from them. Naomi knew this wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth achieving ever was. The conference room was filled with soft morning light, glass walls offering a panoramic view of the bustling city below. Around the long oak table sat Brooks Aviation's senior executives. Their faces reflected a mix of curiosity and cautious skepticism. Daniel Rhodes stood at the head, his usual confident demeanor tempered by the gravity of the conversation ahead. Naomi entered with quiet grace, the sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor echoing slightly. Her tailored navy suit was sharp, its clean lines mirroring the precision in her gaze. As she took her seat, Naomi felt the weight of the room's attention. Some eyes watched with respect, others with reservation. She welcomed both. Naomi Brooks took her seat at the long, polished table, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. Some were curious, others cautious. She welcomed both. Daniel Rhodes stood at the head of the table, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the senior executives of Brooks Aviation. Thank you all for being here, Daniel began. As you're aware, an incident occurred on one of our flights recently. It has highlighted areas where we need to improve, not just as a company, but as individuals. He gestured toward Naomi. Naomi Brooks, our executive vice president, is here to outline her vision for how we move forward. Naomi nodded and stood. Her presence, as always, was commanding but approachable. She began with a recounting of the flight, just the facts. No embellishment was needed. The truth was powerful enough on its own. As she spoke, Naomi noted the subtle shifts in the room. Some executives leaned forward, listening intently. Others exchanged glances, their expressions harder to read. But Naomi pressed on. She outlined her proposal for a comprehensive inclusivity program, mandatory unconscious bias training, a review of hiring and promotion practices, and the formation of an internal oversight committee. This isn't just about preventing incidents like the one I experienced, she concluded. It's about fostering a culture where every employee and every customer feels respected and valued. If we can achieve that, we won't just be an airline, we'll be a beacon of progress for this entire industry. The room fell into a heavy silence, Naomi's words settling over the table like a thick fog. Then, Daniel began to clap. One by one, the others followed. Some hesitant, others enthusiastic. It's a bold plan, Daniel said once the applause faded. But it's the right one. Let's make it happen. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, drafts, and negotiations. Not everyone was quick to embrace Naomi's vision. Some executives argued that the changes were too ambitious or disruptive. Others balked at the potential costs, both financial and reputational. But Naomi met every challenge with patience and unwavering resolve. She anticipated the resistance. She knew it came from fear of change, fear of accountability. But Naomi also knew that fear was no excuse for inaction. During one particularly tense meeting, an executive leaned forward, frustration evident in his voice. With all due respect, Naomi, he said sharply, is this really necessary? That flight attendant was dealt with. Isn't that enough? Naomi met his gaze, her expression steady. No, she replied, her voice calm but resolute. It's not enough to address the symptoms. We have to treat the root cause. Otherwise, we're just waiting for the next incident to happen. The room fell silent. The executive sat back, his argument dissolving under the weight of Naomi's words. Late one evening, as Naomi was leaving the office, a soft voice stopped her in the lobby. Miss Brooks? She turned to find a young flight attendant standing nearby. His uniform was crisp, but his expression was nervous, earnest. I just wanted to thank you, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Naomi tilted her head. For what? She asked gently. The words rushed out in a torrent. For speaking up. I've seen things, heard things that didn't sit right with me. But I didn't think I could do anything about it. Seeing what you did, it gave me hope. It made me realize that change is possible. Naomi's gaze softened. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Change is always possible, she said quietly, but it takes all of us to make it happen. Your voice matters. Don't ever forget that." The young man's eyes shone with gratitude as he nodded and walked away. Naomi watched him go, feeling a quiet but profound sense of fulfillment. This was why she fought. Not for recognition, but for people like him. People who needed to see that standing up for what was right could make a difference. Weeks later, Brooks Aviation launched its new inclusivity program. The initiative rippled beyond the company, drawing attention across the industry. The first training session took place in a large auditorium filled with employees from every department. Naomi stood at the podium, her presence as steady and graceful as it had been in the boardroom. "This isn't the end of the journey," she said, addressing the packed room. "It's just the beginning. Together, we can build a future where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. Let's make that future a reality." The room erupted into applause. Naomi looked out at the sea of faces, knowing that this was the real work. The ripples from that single flight were beginning to spread. As Naomi Brooks stepped off the stage, the energy in the room lingered, palpable and electric. She felt a quiet swell of pride, not for herself, but for the collective effort that had brought them to this moment. Near the back of the room, Daniel Rhodes stood with his arms crossed, a subtle smile tugging at his lips. His eyes met Naomi's, and he gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of all they had accomplished together. Naomi returned the nod, her heart steady, her purpose unwavering. This wasn't just a victory. It was a transformation, a seed of change that would grow far beyond anything they could imagine. The weeks following the launch of the inclusivity program were both triumphant and exhausting. For every step forward, there were shadows of resistance lurking beneath the surface. Naomi often found herself in her office late into the night, the lights of Brighton Bay twinkling silently outside her floor-to-ceiling windows. Papers were strewn across her desk, and a half-finished cup of tea sat forgotten beside her laptop. Her eyes scanned employee feedback from training sessions, alongside reports of incidents that had quietly surfaced in the aftermath. The weight of the task ahead pressed against her shoulders, yet she couldn't stop. The stakes were too high. One evening, as Naomi prepared to gather her things, her assistant Maya entered carrying a thick envelope. "This came for you," Maya said, setting it on the desk. Naomi picked it up, her eyes catching the Brooks Aviation logo stamped in the corner. She carefully opened the envelope and slid out a letter written in elegant cursive on high-quality stationery. "Miss Brooks, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I feel compelled to share my story. I've been with the airline for over 20 years. I've seen the good, the bad, and everything in between. For too long, I stayed silent, watching comments, actions, and decisions that didn't reflect the values we claim to uphold. When I heard about your experience on that flight, it struck a nerve, not because I was surprised, but because it was finally being addressed. I wanted to thank you for standing up. Not just for yourself, but for all of us who have felt unseen or unheard. Your courage sparked something I never thought I'd feel again. Hope. I'm not signing my name because I'm still finding my own courage, but I wanted you to know that your efforts matter. Please don't stop." Naomi read the letter twice, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the paper as her thoughts swirled. The words were raw and honest. They reminded her of the faces she had seen during the training sessions, some eager, others skeptical, and a few outright resistant. But this letter was proof that the seeds she had planted were beginning to take root. With great care, Naomi folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer, resting it gently beside her notepad. It was a small but powerful reminder of why she couldn't afford to falter. Despite the program's early successes, not everyone welcomed the changes. Whispers of dissent began to circulate, quiet but insidious. Some employees dismissed the training as unnecessary, labeling it an overreaction to isolated incidents. Others resisted more openly, questioning the need for inclusivity initiatives at all. Naomi became aware of the murmurs during a routine meeting with the Inclusivity Committee. One member, a young woman from Human Resources named Alyssa, shifted in her seat as she spoke. "We've been monitoring feedback from the sessions," Alyssa said, her voice steady but uncertain. "Most of it has been positive, but there's a small group that isn't on board. They feel the changes are too much, too fast." Naomi leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. Change is never comfortable, she said, meeting Alyssa's gaze. Those who resist often do so because it forces them to confront things they'd rather ignore. She let the words hang in the air. That doesn't mean we stop, Naomi continued, her tone soft but unyielding. It means we push harder. The room fell silent as Naomi's words settled. Alyssa nodded, her confidence seemingly bolstered. You're right, Alyssa said. We'll keep moving forward. Late one night, Naomi sat alone in her penthouse, the glow of Brighton Bay's skyline spilling across the room. The anonymous letter lay on the coffee table, its words echoing softly in Naomi's mind. Despite the program's progress, doubt crept in like an uninvited guest. Was she doing enough? Could she truly shift the deeply rooted biases within the company? And if not, was it worth the fight? Naomi leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Her mind drifted to memories of her childhood, her mother's voice ringing softly in her ear. Change doesn't happen overnight, Naomi, but it starts with one choice. And that choice is yours to make. The memory grounded her, pulling her from the edge of uncertainty. She opened her eyes, gazing at the twinkling lights outside. Naomi understood then. She wasn't fighting for immediate victory. She was planting seeds for something that would grow long after she was gone. And that was enough to keep going. Naomi Brooks sat in the quiet of her penthouse, the glow of Brighton Bay flickering through the windows. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath her, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She stared into her cup of now cold tea, the question looping through her mind. Was she doing enough? Could one person truly change a system so deeply entrenched in its ways? And if not, was it even worth the fight? Naomi leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes. Her mind wandered to memories of her childhood, the soft hum of her mother's voice, the quiet resilience that had shaped her. Her mother had always stood tall, even when the world tried to shrink her. Change doesn't happen in a day, Naomi, but it starts with a choice, and that choice is yours to make. The memory steadied her, grounding her in the truth she had known all along. Change was slow, messy, often thankless, but necessary. And Naomi had made her choice long ago. A week later, during a routine board meeting, an unexpected voice broke through the usual flow of reports and projections. It was Richard Hale, the same executive who had questioned Naomi's inclusivity initiative weeks earlier. He stood, clearing his throat as the room's attention shifted toward him. I'll admit, Richard began, his tone hesitant, I wasn't fully on board with this initiative at first. He glanced briefly at Naomi before continuing. But after attending one of the training sessions and listening to the experiences shared by our staff, I realized just how much I didn't know about their struggles, about my own blind spots. Richard paused, his gaze softening. I wanted to thank you, Naomi, he said sincerely, for pushing us to do better. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Naomi felt a flicker of surprise, followed by quiet gratitude. She nodded, her voice calm but warm. Thank you for being open to change, she replied. That's all I've ever asked. As the program continued to unfold, its impact became undeniable. Complaints of discrimination dropped noticeably. Employee satisfaction surveys reflected a growing sense of inclusion. Even customers began to comment on the shift in Brooks Aviation's culture. Naomi often found herself reflecting on the journey, how far they had come and how far they still had to go. It hadn't been easy. It never would be. But as she sat in her office one evening, watching the city lights dance beyond the glass, she felt something rare: accomplishment. This wasn't the end of the story. It was another step in a journey that would continue long after she was gone. And that was enough. The months following the launch of the inclusivity program were transformative, both for the airline and for Naomi. What had begun as a response to a single incident evolved into a company-wide cultural shift that rippled across the industry. Naomi had driven the initiative forward with her usual precision and resilience. But even she hadn't anticipated how far the impact would reach. Feedback from employees poured in steadily. Stories surfaced of coworkers standing up for one another, of managers reflecting on their own biases, of customers noticing a renewed warmth and professionalism. Naomi saw each story as a milestone, proof that the seeds she had planted were beginning to bloom. Yet she knew progress wasn't linear. Resistance lingered, quiet but persistent. Some employees voiced dissatisfaction, dismissing the changes as unnecessary or disruptive. Naomi didn't let it deter her. Change wasn't about making everyone comfortable. It was about doing what was right. One afternoon, Naomi was reviewing program performance metrics when her phone buzzed. It was Daniel Rhodes. His tone carried a rare edge of excitement. "Naomi," he began, "I just had a fascinating conversation with a group of CEOs from other airlines. They've been watching what we've done here and they're impressed." Naomi leaned back in her chair, intrigued. "What kind of conversation are we talking about?" she asked. Daniel chuckled softly. "They want to replicate what we've done, not just within their companies, but across the industry. They're proposing an industry-wide initiative, and they want you to lead it." Naomi blinked, the weight of his words settling over her. A surge of pride welled up, but it was tempered by the enormity of the task ahead. "Daniel, that's ambitious," she said, her voice steady but thoughtful. "Do you really think they'll follow through?" "They're serious, Naomi," Daniel replied. "And frankly, they need someone with your vision and leadership to guide them. This is your chance to make an even bigger impact." Naomi sat quietly for a moment, her mind racing. She thought of the anonymous letter she had received, the quiet voice of an employee too afraid to sign their name, but bold enough to share their hope. She thought of the young flight attendant who had thanked her in the lobby, and the countless others who watched from the sidelines wondering if change was truly possible. Finally, Naomi exhaled, a small smile forming. "I'm in," she said. If it meant creating real, lasting change, she was ready. As Naomi Brooks considered the weight of the opportunity before her, she thought of the young flight attendant who had thanked her, the faces in the training sessions, and the quiet resilience reflected in the anonymous letter. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a responsibility. "I'll do it," Naomi said finally, her voice unwavering. "If it means creating real change, I'm in." News of Naomi's new role spread quickly across Brooks Aviation. Her colleagues, while saddened by her departure, celebrated the achievement with admiration and gratitude. A farewell event was arranged, an elegant evening gathering that mirrored Naomi's understated but profound influence on the company. That night, she stood in front of a room filled with familiar faces, the glow of chandeliers bathing the space in soft light. Her heart swelled with a bittersweet mix of pride and nostalgia. As glasses were raised in her honor, Naomi took a breath, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the crowd. "Thank you," she began, her words steady and heartfelt. "Not just for tonight, but for trusting me, for believing in what we've built together. This isn't goodbye, it's the beginning of something much larger." Naomi's eyes swept over the room, meeting the gazes of those she had worked alongside. "What we've started here proves that change is possible, even when it feels impossible," she continued. "I promise to carry the lessons we've learned into this next chapter. And I know that together, we've laid the foundation for something that will continue to grow." As she finished, the applause was thunderous, a testament to the impact she had made. Naomi's final day at the airline felt like the end of a chapter. Boarding a flight to New York City, where the headquarters for the new initiative awaited, Naomi settled into her seat. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile, gently placing a pair of noise-canceling headphones on her tray. "Miss Brooks," the attendant said softly, "on behalf of the crew, thank you for everything you've done for us." Naomi's chest tightened with emotion. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. As the plane ascended, Naomi gazed out the window, watching as Brighton Bay shrank into a tapestry of lights below. The hum of the engines was steady, comforting. She felt at peace, knowing she had left Brooks Aviation better than she had found it. Months later, Naomi stood at the podium of the Global Aviation Summit, addressing leaders from airlines around the world. Behind her, a large screen displayed the name of the initiative she had been chosen to lead. Elevate, an industry united for inclusion and respect. Naomi spoke with the same grace and conviction that had guided her through the most challenging moments of her career. "This isn't just about policies or programs," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "It's about creating a culture, one that values every individual, that recognizes the power of diversity, and that strives for equity in every corner of our industry." When she finished, the applause was resounding. One by one, industry leaders approached her, expressing admiration and pledging their commitment to the initiative. For the first time, Naomi felt a fulfillment she hadn't known before. This fight was no longer just her own. It had become a collective movement. Back at Brooks Aviation, the changes Naomi had implemented continued to thrive. Employees shared stories about the culture shift, about how they felt empowered to speak up and support one another. Customer feedback reflected the warmth and respect that had become a hallmark of the airline's service. One day, the young woman joined Brooks Aviation as a flight attendant. She had read about Naomi's story and it had inspired her to apply. On her first flight, she carried with her a quiet but determined resolve to continue the legacy Naomi had begun. As Naomi walked the halls of Elevate's headquarters, she felt more purposeful than ever. The work she was doing now extended far beyond her lifetime. It was shaping an industry that would better serve future generations. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who had been inspired to stand up, speak out, and fight for a world where respect and dignity weren't privileges, but rights. And as Naomi stood before a new group of leaders preparing to launch the next phase of Elevate, her journey was far from over. It was just beginning. As Naomi Brooks stood before a new group of leaders, ready to guide them toward meaningful change, she felt the weight of the moment. Her journey wasn't ending. It was evolving. What had started as a quiet moment of injustice on a single flight had transformed into something far greater. It had become a catalyst for change. Naomi's courage and determination had rippled beyond her own experience, challenging the deeply rooted biases embedded in the industry. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had paved the way for a better, more inclusive future. For everyone. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join us for more powerful stories that highlight the strength of resilience, justice, and humanity. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.